The grass did not move. That was the first wrong thing. Corporal Dio Mensa lay on his back in a field somewhere south of what used to be Lyon, and stared up at a sky the color of a bruise healing, and the tall, pale grass that surrounded him on all sides stood perfectly, impossibly still. No wind, not even the ghost of one. Yet the air was not stagnant. He could feel it moving across his skin, cool and deliberate, as if the world were breathing in a careful, measured way, and had simply decided that grass did not warrant the effort. He took inventory of himself the way Sergeant Osei had taught him, back when Sergeant Osei was still alive. Fingers, toes, ribs. The burning along his left thigh where the ejection harness had torn. The deep ache behind his eyes that meant either concussion or dehydration. And the fact that he was thinking clearly enough to distinguish between the two meant it was probably dehydration. Probably. He sat up. The escape pod had come down 200 meters to the east, judging by the smoke. What remained of it was not much. The Veth had hit the reconnaissance craft over Marseille at 0612, and he had been falling for. He checked his wrist display and found it blank, the screen cracked and dark. He had been falling for whatever time had passed since then. The pod's beacon would not work. He had known that before he pulled the eject handle. He had pulled it anyway, because there was no other option, and Dio Mensa was not the kind of man who sat still in a burning cockpit, waiting for someone to give him a better choice. He stood. The grass reached his hips. In the distance, the ruined spine of a city, Lyon, or what the Veth had made of it in 11 months of occupation. The towers still stood, mostly, but they were wrong now. Threaded through with the pale crystalline latticework the Veth grew wherever they settled, bioluminescent and cold, pulsing with the slow rhythm of their collective thought. From this distance it looked almost beautiful, like a city strung with lights for a festival that would never end. He began walking. Yui Tanaka had not been authorized to board the transport. This was, in the grand scale of current human problems, a relatively minor infraction. The Veth had established what they called restoration zones across the occupied territories. Areas where human population was permitted to continue, provided the humans in those areas did not interfere with Veth infrastructure, did not attempt to communicate outside the zone's approved frequencies, and did not, under any circumstances, approach the quarantine sectors. The quarantine sectors were where the Veth were doing something that no human had yet been able to clearly identify. And the Veth's response to any human who wandered too close was consistent and final. Yui was a communications specialist. She had spent 4 months in the Lyon Restoration Zone, listening to frequencies she was not supposed to be monitoring. And 3 weeks ago she had heard something, a signal, human, originating from Quarantine Sector 7, which occupied the Eastern Industrial District and the old university campus beyond it. The signal was encoded in a protocol so old it was practically archaeological, a handshake format that the military had used in the 2030s, before everything went standardized. She recognized it because her brother Kenji had been obsessed with legacy radio systems, the way some people are obsessed with old cars or dead languages. And he had spent one patient summer teaching her the fundamentals while she pretended to be annoyed. Kenji had been assigned to the Eastern District when the Veth came. The transport was a civilian vessel, one of the Veth-permitted tour groups that moved between restoration zones, ostensibly so that separated families could attempt to reunite. The Veth tolerated these, which Yui had spent some time thinking about. She had concluded that the Veth found human family structures genuinely incomprehensible, and therefore somewhat interesting, the way a scientist might tolerate a strange behavior in a specimen under observation. They did not understand why humans formed the bonds they did. They did not understand why a person would risk their life to find someone whose genetic material they happened to share. This was, she thought, as she pressed herself flat against the underside of the transport's rear storage platform and listened to the Veth sentry pulse its light pattern across the loading bay, their most significant miscalculation. The transport lifted. She breathed through her mouth, slow and shallow, and did not allow herself to think about what was waiting in Sector 7. She thought instead about Kenji's hands on an old radio set, the careful way he'd explained the handshake protocol, the expression on his face when she'd gotten it right on the first try, the particular way his eyes had gone wide, then immediately narrow, like he was recalculating everything he'd assumed about her. She thought, "I'm coming." She thought, "You'd better be there." The prisoner's name was Lev Okafor, and he had not expected to live this long. He had been in Veth custody for 6 months. He had been charged by the Joint Emergency Human Authority that still nominally administered the unoccupied Northern Territories with terrorism, specifically with the destruction of a Veth lattice node in Hamburg that had killed 4 Veth collective units and disrupted communications across the Northern occupation for 11 days. What the charge did not mention was that the lattice node had also been functioning as a control relay for the behavioral suppression signals the Veth were broadcasting into the Hamburg restoration zone, and that the 11 days of disruption had allowed approximately 4,000 people to stop sleepwalking through their lives and start making plans. He did not regret Hamburg. He regretted some of the methods. He did not regret the outcome. The facility where he was held was clean and quiet. The Veth who administered it under the terms of the armistice did not believe in dramatic displays of authority. They did not need to. Their handler for the human prisoner population was a unit they had assigned a human interface designation, a construction of soft synthetic materials and programmed behavior that was meant to approximate a human face, human voice, human mannerism. The unit's designation in the Veth system was something Lev could not pronounce. He called it Saramea, because it needed a name, and he needed the small act of naming to remind himself that it was a thing, not a person. Saramea was, objectively speaking, not a person. It was a Veth interface construct. Its function was to communicate mission parameters to the human prisoner and to monitor his mental state for signs of instability that might compromise the mission. The mission was this. Lev Okafor would be transported to the occupied corridor south of Lyon. He would be equipped with a device. The Veth called it a resonance disruptor. Lev had a more colorful term for it. That was capable of broadcasting on a frequency that would collapse Veth lattice coherence across a radius of approximately 8 kilometers. This would, the Veth explained calmly, allow their own internal security forces to isolate and eliminate a rogue collective cluster that had developed what they described as divergent processing patterns. The Veth did not elaborate on what divergent processing meant for a hive mind. Lev suspected it meant something roughly equivalent to conscience. He was not expected to survive the mission. The device required proximity to the primary lattice node to function, and proximity to the primary lattice node was for a human a death sentence by other means. The Veth had been honest about this in their flat, explanatory way, the way someone might explain that a particular chemical reaction produces heat. Lev had been presented with this information and had said, "All right." What Lev had not told the Veth, and what he suspected Saramea had not extrapolated from its monitoring of him, was that he had modified the device. The modification had taken him 3 months of careful work, using components he'd accumulated through a process of patient, methodical theft from the facility's maintenance supplies. He had done this while humming, because he hummed when he was working, and he saw no reason to stop being himself, just because the world had ended. What he hummed, most often, was a song his mother had sung to him when he was small. He didn't know the name of it. He suspected she had made it up. It had no words, just a melody that moved like water over stones, uneven and calm at the same time. She had hummed it while she cooked, while she worked, while she sat at the window in the evenings watching the street below. He hummed it now while he checked the device's modified circuitry one final time in the back of the transport, and Saramea watched him with its approximated eyes and said nothing. "You want to know what I'm doing," Lev said, without looking up. "I can observe the modification," Saramea said. Its voice was careful, calibrated for a kind of neutrality. "The modification is not consistent with the original mission parameters." "No," Lev agreed. "It's not." A pause. In a human, it might have been the pause of someone choosing their words. In Saramea, he wasn't sure what it was. "The modification will extend the device's range," Saramea said. "It will also eliminate the requirement for proximity to the primary lattice node. Yes, you will survive. That's the idea." Another pause. Longer this time. "I do not understand the purpose," Saramea said. "The probability of mission success is unchanged. The effect on Veth lattice coherence is the same. The only variable that changes is your survival. Why is your survival a parameter you introduced?" Lev looked up at it then. He thought about explaining. He thought about Sergeant Osi, about Hamburg, about 4,000 people who stopped sleepwalking. He thought about his mother at the window. "Because I've got things to do," he said. "After." The city was wrong in a dozen ways that Dio could not have described to anyone who hadn't seen it. It wasn't the lattice work, though that was wrong enough. It was the small things. The way the pigeons had stopped landing anywhere near Veth infrastructure. He'd noticed that over Marseille, too. Birds refusing the perches they'd used for years, navigating around the crystalline growths the way water bends around stone. The way the light through the lattice cast shadows at angles that didn't match the sun. The way sound moved differently in the occupied streets. Not quieter exactly, but redistributed, as if the lattice were absorbing certain frequencies and redirecting others. He moved through the outskirts in the early afternoon, using the long shadows of the ruins for cover. He had his sidearm and 11 rounds. He had a water bottle, nearly empty, and a ration bar that he ate in 4 bites without tasting it. He had the map in his head. Outdated, he knew, because the Veth had been restructuring the city's geography in ways that had made most preoccupation maps somewhere between unreliable and actively dangerous. What he was trying to reach was the resistance cell that intelligence said was operating out of the university district. What he did not know was that the university district had been designated Quarantine Sector 7 4 months ago, and that the resistance cell had gone dark in the same week, and that the only signal coming out of it was a handshake on a legacy protocol that a young woman in a restoration zone 50 kilometers north had spent 3 weeks translating. He found the first survivor about a kilometer into the city. She was sitting in the doorway of what had been a pharmacy, sorting through a pile of thousands with the focused, methodical attention of someone who had done this enough times, thought that it no longer requires active thought. She was perhaps 60, small and angular, with the particular stillness of people who have learned that stillness costs less than movement. When Dio appeared at the end of the street, she looked up without flinching, which told him several things about how long she had been surviving here. "Soldier," she said. "Ma'am, you just come down?" He touched the dried blood on his temple. "Reconnaissance. My craft was hit." She nodded, unsurprised. The Veth have been over the southern corridor the last 3 days. "Something's happening in the sector." She went back to sorting. "You're heading to the university." It wasn't a question. Intel said there was a cell operating there. There was. She picked up a coil of wire, examined it, set it aside. The cell is still there. 3 of them, maybe 4. I've lost count. But the Veth closed the perimeter around the sector in the last week. You can't go through the main approaches. "There's another way?" She looked at him for a long moment, weighing something. "There are 2 ways," she said finally. "One goes through the old maintenance tunnels under the river. Veth lattice doesn't penetrate below 8 meters, so there's no surveillance in the lower tunnels. Problem is, there's also no earth circulation, and the tunnels flood with 2 centimeters of rain. It hasn't rained, but that means nothing. The Veth have been doing something with the weather systems, and the old rules don't apply. And the second way? The second way is to wait," she said. "Something's coming from the north. I don't know what. But the Veth have been pulling units from the perimeter in that direction for the last 6 hours, and a gap is going to open. Maybe tonight. Maybe tomorrow." Dio crouched down so he was at eye level with her. "What's your name?" She looked at him with the expression of someone who hadn't been asked that question in some time. "Celeste," she said. "Corporal Dio Mensa." He extended his hand and she looked at it for a moment before shaking it with a grip that surprised him. "What's in the sector, Celeste, not the cell? What are the Veth doing there?" She was quiet for a while. The salvage sorted itself through her fingers. "You know how the collective works," she said. "Every Veth unit is part of the lattice. Every unit shares memory, impulse, decision. There's no individual. There's just the whole." "Yes, except something in the sector has stopped sharing." She looked up at him, and her eyes were deeply tired and deeply focused at the same time. "There's a cluster of units in the university district that went, I don't know the right word, quiet. 3 months ago. They stopped pulsing in the lattice rhythm. The other Veth have been trying to bring them back into coherence, and it's not working. And now they're sending something in." Dio was quiet. "What happens to a Veth cluster that stops being part of the collective?" he asked. "I don't know," Celeste said. "But I know what happens to people who were in the sector when it happened." She paused. "They're still in there. Nobody's been hurt. Nobody's been moved. They're just living there, with the quiet ones. Since 3 months ago." She went back to her sorting. "I'd wait for the gap," she said. "But I'm just an old woman who doesn't have anywhere else to be." The transport came down 20 meters inside the sector perimeter, and Yui was already moving before it fully settled. She dropped from the undercarriage into an alley that smelled of old rain and Veth lattice. That particular metallic sweet smell, like ozone and something organic she'd never been able to name. She pressed herself against the wall and waited. The transport's boarding ramp extended. 2 Veth units descended, pulsed a brief exchange of light between themselves, and moved north along the perimeter road. She moved south. The signal had been coming from the university campus, and the campus was 3 blocks in. She navigated by memory and pre-war mapping, knowing both were inadequate, correcting constantly as the reality of the occupied streets replaced her expectations. The lattice work here was denser than in the outer city, thick cables of crystalline growth connecting building to building, pulsing slowly in the deep blue-green that the Veth used for internal communication rather than the sharp white of active surveillance. The blue-green meant they weren't watching, or the blue-green meant they weren't watching the way she knew how to detect. She kept moving. The campus gate was open. This was wrong enough that she stopped and examined it for a full 30 seconds before stepping through. The Veth ran closed perimeters. Open gates meant one of 3 things. The area was clear, the area was a trap, or something had changed the equation. She chose to believe the third option because it was the only one she could operate under. The campus was, improbably, quiet. Not the charged, watchful quiet of a Veth-controlled zone. Something else. She walked the main avenue between the old faculty buildings and felt the difference in the air. The way you feel the difference between a room where someone has recently been angry and a room where they haven't. The latticework here pulsed at a slower rhythm. Much slower. Almost, she thought, almost like breath. She found the signal source in the basement of the old engineering building. It was Kenji. He was thinner than she remembered. He had grown a beard which didn't suit him at all, and his hair was longer, and he was sitting in a circle of salvaged radio equipment with 2 other survivors. A young man she didn't know, and an older woman who introduced herself as Dr. Foray. The 3 of them looked up when she came through the door, and for a moment nobody said anything. Then Kenji said, "You used the old handshake." "You used it first," she said. He stood up. He was shaking slightly. She was too. "You're not supposed to be in the sector," he said. "Neither are you." He crossed the room and hugged her, and she let him. And for a moment she didn't think about the Veth or the perimeter or the gap in surveillance that was almost certainly temporary. When she pulled back, she said, "What's happening here? What are the Veth doing in this sector?" Kenji looked at Dr. Foray. Something passed between them. Not exactly hesitation, more like calibration. "The Veth cluster that's been assigned to this sector," Dr. Foray said carefully, "has been undergoing something. For about 3 months. They've been observing us. Not surveilling, observing. Watching the way we operate, the way we make decisions individually, the way we form attachments." She paused. "I believe they're trying to understand something. And I believe the rest of the Veth find this threatening." "Threatening how?" "Understanding something is the first step to becoming it." Dr. Foray looked at her hands. "If one cluster of the collective starts developing individual decision-making capacity, starts understanding what it means to want something, personally, separate from the hive, then the collective's integrity is at risk. They can't allow it." Yui's chest went cold. "So they're sending something in to stop it?" "Yes," Kenji said. "Something is coming from the north. We intercepted fragments of Veth lattice communication last week. We can't decode most of it, but there's a signature we've learned to recognize. They're sending a resonance disruptor." She stared at him. "A resonance disruptor collapses lattice coherence in an 8-kilometer radius," Dr. Foray said, "which is roughly the extent of the sector. Which means," Yui said slowly, "every Veth unit in the sector would be severed from the collective," Kenji said. "Permanently. They'd essentially cease to function. As a collective entity anyway. And us?" A pause. "The disruptor is a Veth weapon. The frequency is tuned for Veth biology. For us it's, we don't know. We have approximately 12 hours to find out." The gap in the perimeter opened at 2340. Deo had been watching from a rooftop for 4 hours when he saw the Veth pull north. 12 units moving in tight formation, lights shifting from surveillance white to the deep amber of emergency response. He was moving before they'd fully cleared the street, down the fire escape, and through the gap in the lattice wall that Celeste had told him about, with the flat certainty of someone who had been watching it for months. The maintenance tunnel was as bad as she'd described. Low ceiling, black water up to his ankles for the first 100 meters, the smell of something ancient and wrong. He moved with his phone's torch on minimum brightness, one hand trailing the wall, counting his steps. The phone still worked for light, and nothing else. The Veth had managed global communication infrastructure inside of a month, rerouting or burning everything that might allow human coordination. He had learned to be grateful for small functionings. He came up inside the sector through a utility access hatch, behind what used to be the Student Union building, and the first thing he noticed was the quiet, not silence. He could still hear the distant pulse of the Veth lattice, the low subsonic hum that you felt in your back teeth more than your ears. But it was slower here, more like a heartbeat that had calmed after a long run. And the lattice work itself, threading along the building walls, had shifted color. The surveillance white was gone, replaced by something he hadn't seen before. A soft, almost amber luminescence. Warm, for lack of a better word, though he knew that was projection. He found the engineering building by following the smell of old coffee and working electronics, which was, he thought, about the most human navigation system possible. He came through the basement door into a room lit by the glow of salvaged screens and found 4 people looking at him. One of them was a young woman he'd never seen. One was an older woman who exuded the particular authority of academics. One was a young man who looked like he'd been taking apart radios since childhood, and the fourth was a soldier. Not his unit. Not any unit he recognized. But the bearing was unmistakable, and the bearing was human, and Dio let out a breath he had been holding for approximately 8 hours. He said, "Corporal Dio Mensa, 4th Aerial Reconnaissance." The other soldier said, "There's no 4th Aerial Reconnaissance anymore. I know. It's a formality." They looked at each other for a moment, taking measure in the way soldiers do, quick and thorough and unsentimental. "Sergeant Amara Diallo," the other soldier said. "Sit down. We don't have a lot of time." They were 12 people in total. 3 soldiers, Diallo, Mensa, and a young private named Torres, who was 17 years old and had joined up with a conscripted unit 4 months before the Veth arrived, and had not yet found a way to stop looking surprised that he was still alive. 2 academics, a communication specialist and her brother, and 5 civilians who had been inside the sector perimeter when it closed and had simply been left, not herded, not processed, left in place with their routines, their salvage systems, their small daily lives, as if the Veth cluster had decided that observation required subjects and had elected not to disturb the specimens. "What, Doctor?" Foray told them, in the basement of the engineering building with the amber light of a changed lattice pulsing through the high windows, was this. The cluster, she called them the quiet ones, because they needed a name, had begun changing 3 months ago. She didn't know what triggered it. Some contact with one human resident of the sector, she suspected, though she couldn't identify the individual. What she knew was that the quiet ones had stopped participating in collective decision-making. They had begun observing individual humans in sustained, focused ways. They had begun, she believed, to accumulate individual memory. Not shared memory distributed across the hive, but localized memory, attached to specific units, about specific humans. They had begun, she said carefully, to recognize people. This was, in Veth terms, pathological. The collective did not permit individual recognition. The collective did not permit individual anything. Individuation was the disease, and the collective's response to disease was the same as any organism's response to infection. Containment, then elimination. "The resonance disruptor," Sergeant Diallo said. "Do we know when?" "Fragments suggest sunrise," Kenji said. 6 hours, give or take. "And the carrier?" "Single unit from what we can decode." "Escorted." Dio looked around the room. 12 people, 6 hours. A weapon incoming that would, at minimum, collapse the quiet ones. And might, or might not, do something unquantifiable to 12 humans in an 8-kilometer radius. "The quiet ones," he said. "Are they?" He stopped, unsure how to frame the question. "Are they dangerous?" Dr. Foray looked at him for a moment. "No," she said. "They're confused. Possibly frightened, if that category applies to them. They're experiencing something they have no framework for, individuality, desire, recognition, and they are having that experience while simultaneously receiving the collective's signal to stop having it." She paused. "If you want to think about it in human terms, they're being told by everyone around them that what they're feeling is wrong, and they don't have the vocabulary to argue back. They just have the feeling." The room was quiet for a moment. "We help them," Torres said. Everyone looked at him. He went slightly red but didn't back down. He was 17 years old and had survived 4 months of things that should have broken him, and the back-down mechanism appeared to have been knocked loose. "They're not the enemy," Torres said. "Not these ones. And if we let the collective destroy them, we lose the first evidence that Veth can change, that they can be reached." He looked at Dr. Foray. "That's what you're saying, isn't it? That's why this is important." Dr. Foray looked at him for a long time. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what I'm saying." Lev arrived at the sector perimeter at 0320. Saramea was with him. The Veth escort, 4 units moving in the amber signaling pattern that indicated a mission of internal security stopped at the perimeter edge. Their instructions, apparently, did not include entering the sector. Their instructions were to deliver the prisoner and the device to the threshold and wait. The prisoner and the device crossed the threshold. "They're not coming in," Lev said without looking back. "Correct," Saramea said. "The escort is not authorized for sector entry. Why not?" A pause. "The sector environment may be. The collective is concerned about exposure to divergent processing patterns." Lev stopped walking. He turned and looked at Saramea, at its approximated face, its careful eyes. "They're afraid of catching it," he said. Saramea did not answer, which was, Lev thought, an answer. He kept walking. Saramea kept pace with him. The lattice work around them pulsed in that slow amber warmth, and Lev was aware of being watched. Not by the hard white surveillance of the collective, but by something softer, present, aware. "They're watching us," he said. "Yes," Saramea said. "The quiet ones." "Yes." He walked in silence for a moment. Then, because silence had never been comfortable to him, "What does it feel like? Being watched by something that started thinking for..." Saramea was quiet long enough that he glanced at it. "It is uncomfortable," Saramea said at last. "The sensation that another entity is forming a judgment about you, specifically, not about humans in aggregate, about you." "Yeah," Lev said. "That's what it is." They reached the engineering building just after 04, and Lev was not particularly surprised to find 8 people he'd never met who were apparently also trying to prevent him from completing his mission. He was a little surprised that one of them was a soldier from aerial reconnaissance, because 4th Aerial Reconnaissance had been listed as destroyed in the Lion engagement. But the world had been consistently poor at matching its records with reality for the last 11 months. He set the device down on a workbench and said, "All right, who wants to tell me why I shouldn't use this?" Dr. Foray told him. Kenji and Yui told him. Diallo told him. He listened, which was something he had always been better at than people expected, given that he talked a great deal. When they were done, he looked at the device for a long moment. Then he looked at Saramea. "You heard all of that," he said. "Yes," Saramea said, "and you're still going to tell the collective about the quiet ones." A pause. A long one. The amber light moved slowly through the room. "The collective will already know," Saramea said. "That is the nature of the collective. I have been monitoring this mission. My observations are transmitted to the collective in continuous real time." Another pause. "This is my function." "Your function," Lev repeated. "Right." He picked up the device and turned it over in his hands. 3 months of careful work. 11 components lifted from maintenance supplies one at a time. A modification that had transformed a suicide mission into, potentially, something else. "What's the range on the original configuration?" Sergeant Diallo asked. 8 kilometers, approximately. Collapses Veth lattice coherence within that radius. "And your modification?" Lev was quiet for a moment. 15, he said. "And selectable frequency tuning." The room absorbed this. "Sextal," Yui said. "Meaning you can choose which part of the lattice frequency to disrupt." "Meaning," Lev said, "that I can disrupt the collective's coherence signal to the quiet ones without disrupting the quiet ones themselves. It's like, you know when you used to get radio interference, 2 signals on overlapping frequencies. You could tune to cancel one without losing the other if you were careful about it." "If you're careful," Diallo said. "I'm a very careful person," Lev said, which was not entirely true but was true in the ways that mattered. Private Torres said, "And the collective will stop being able to reach the quiet ones. The collective will stop being able to reach anything in the sector for approximately 72 hours. After that, the signal reasserts. But 72 hours that's 72 hours the quiet ones can spend not being told they're broken." He looked at Saramea again. "And it'll reach you," he said, not unkindly, "just as a fact. Whatever the collective knows from you, in 72 hours it stops knowing. You'll be on your own." For 3 days, Saramea was very still. "I have never been on my own," Saramea said. "No," Lev said. "I know," he hummed. Just for a moment, without thinking about it. His mother's melody, a few bars, water over stones. It filled the silence the way that kind of melody does, not loudly, just present. Saramea looked at him. "What is that?" it said. "A song," Lev said. "Sort of. My mother used to hum it. I don't know the name. It has no words." "No. Then how do you know it means what you want it to mean?" Lev thought about this. He thought about his mother at the window, the evenings, the street below. "Because of when she hummed it," he said. Context. Not the words, the moment. Saramea was silent. The amber light moved. Then Saramea said, I will not transmit the contents of this conversation to the collective. Nobody moved. I am still transmitting, Saramea said carefully. I am transmitting that the mission is proceeding. I am not transmitting the nature of the modification. I am. A pause. I am withholding specific information. This is not consistent with my function. No, Lev said. It's not. I find, Saramea said, and stopped. Started again. I find that I have formed a judgment about you, specifically. Not about humans in aggregate. It looked at Lev with its approximated eyes. You concern me as an individual. I do not have a framework for this. Welcome to the club, Torres said very quietly. They deployed at 05:15, with 45 minutes until sunrise. Dio and Diallo took the eastern approach. Yui and Kenji took the communications relay. The salvaged equipment in the basement, which they were going to use to broadcast the modified disruptor signal across every frequency available to them when the moment came, so that any human in receiving range would know what was happening and why. Torres took the western perimeter to watch for the Veth escort, deciding to enter regardless of instructions, Dr. Foray stayed with the civilians and did the thing that people with very clear heads do in crisis, which was explain, carefully and without panic, what was about to happen and what it meant. Saramea stood in the courtyard of the engineering building and looked up at the sky. Lev stood beside it. You don't have to stay, Lev said. Where would I go? Saramea said. Back to the escort. Back to the collective. He paused. You could transmit everything, stop the mission. I could, Saramea said. But I have found. Another of those pauses that might, in something with a longer history of wanting things, have been called struggling. I have found that I do not want to. Yeah, Lev said. That's how it starts. He set the device on the courtyard's stone railing. The sky to the east was beginning to change, the bruised color of the pre-dawn giving way to something lighter. The latticework around the sector pulsed in its slow amber rhythm, and in the streets beyond the engineering building, Lev could sense. Exactly. More feel the way you feel the attention of a room before you enter it. The quiet ones, arranged in their clusters, waiting. They had known, somehow. They had arranged themselves outward from the center of the sector, forming a kind of passive perimeter of their own. Not defensive, Lev thought, but witnessing, present. The way people stand at the edge of something significant because they cannot not stand there. They want to see, Saramea said. Yes, they want to see a human choose, Saramea said slowly. Individually. Without instruction from a collective, they want to see what that looks like. Lev looked out at the pre-dawn city. He thought about Hamburg. He thought about 4,000 people stopping sleepwalking. He thought about the things he had not yet done, and the things he still wanted to do, and the fact that his mother had not taught him the name of the song, just the melody, and he had been meaning for years to figure it out. It looks like this, he said. He activated the device. The wave went out silently. Not silent in the way of a thing that makes no sound, but silent in the way that the most significant things often are, quietly enormous. The kind of event that the world will talk about for decades, but which, in the moment of happening, is just light and frequency and a man standing on a stone railing in the early morning. The lattice across the sector shifted. Not collapsed, not destroyed, but changed. The collective's coherent signal, the constant, hammering, you are wrong, you are wrong, you are wrong that had been broadcasting into the quiet ones for 3 months, went quiet. And in the quiet left behind, something else remained. 72 hours of it. Dio on the eastern perimeter watched the Veth escort units stop moving. Not freeze, pause, the way a person pauses when a thought arrives unexpectedly. The coherent signal had reached them too. Diluted at 15 kilometers, but present enough. The escort units stood in the pre-dawn street for a long moment, and then slowly began to walk back north. Yui in the basement broadcast. She broadcast on every frequency the salvaged equipment could reach, in every protocol she knew. In the legacy handshake her brother had taught her, she broadcast a simple message. Something has changed. Something can change. The first Veth cluster to develop individual cognition is here and is alive and has had 72 hours given to it by a human man who had every reason not to and did it anyway. She broadcast the coordinates. She broadcast the frequency map of the disruptor modification in enough technical detail that anyone who understood communications could replicate it. She broadcast, we are here, we are still here, we are still, against all evidence and all reason, here. Private Torres on the western perimeter watched the sun come up over the ruins of Lyon. He was 17 years old and had been in the war longer than he'd been legally permitted to vote. And the sun coming up over a city full of wrong light and alien crystal work was still, Despite everything, the sun. Coming up. Gold and unstoppable, the way it always had been, the way it would be after the war ended, the way it would be after whatever came next. He thought, we're going to be okay. He had no particular evidence for this. He thought it anyway. Saramea sat on the courtyard stone railing after the device had discharged, and Lev had sat down heavily on the ground beside it, and it looked at the city for a long time. Around them, the quiet ones moved. Not retreating, settling, the way something settles when the pressure against it has been removed. The amber light had deepened, and in it was something that Saramea had been trying to categorize for the last several hours, and had not found a category for. What will happen to them, Saramea said, in 72 hours when the signal reseen asserts? Don't know, Lev said honestly. They'll have had 72 hours. That's different from not having had them. It is not much time. It's something. 72 hours of knowing what you are is more than some people get. He leaned his head back against the railing. And now other people know about them. Dr. Foray will write this up. UE is broadcasting right now. In 72 hours there'll be people trying to figure it out how to extend it, how to reach more clusters, how to have a conversation with the Veth instead of just a war. You believe this is possible, Saramea said. I believe it's more possible now than it was yesterday. He paused. That's the job. Not to solve everything, just to make the next thing possible. Saramea was quiet. The light moved. From somewhere in the courtyard, from one of the quiet ones, in a cluster near the old fountain, came a pulse. A single light pulse, deep amber, at a frequency that was not the collective's coherence signal and not the standard Veth communication band. Saramea looked at it for a long moment. They are trying to communicate, it said, individually, not as a collective signal, as an individual unit producing a personal signal. What are they saying? Saramea was very still. Then, I believe they are saying we see you. Lev was quiet. Huh, he said finally. He started humming, the old song, Water Over Stones, his mother's melody with no name. He hummed it for a while in the growing light, and after a moment, slowly, tentatively, the way someone tries a word in a language they're just beginning, the amber pulse from the cluster near the fountain shifted its rhythm, not matching the melody exactly, but responding to it, finding the spaces between notes and sitting in them. Saramea watched this. You said context, Saramea said. That meaning comes from the moment, not the words. Yes, Lev said. I believe, Saramea said carefully, that I am beginning to understand context. They left the sector at 0830, when Sergeant Diallo judged that the window of disrupted Veth response was sufficient cover for the perimeter crossing. 12 humans and 1 Veth interface unit, moving north through the maintenance tunnels in single file. Lev carried the spent device. UE carried the communications equipment, the most valuable thing a sector. The portable version of it, enough to keep broadcasting. Dio and Diallo covered the rear. Torres walked in the middle of the group and kept looking back, not out of fear but out of the habit of bearing witness to things. The tunnels were dark and cold and smelled of old water. In the darkness, Celeste, whom Deo had gone back for, crossing the city again before dawn to collect her from her pharmacy doorway, because she had given him the information he needed, and the world was too short of people like her to leave them behind. Celeste hummed something under her breath. An old song, a French one, something her mother had known. The sound of it moved through the tunnel in the particular way that sound moves in enclosed spaces, filling the gaps. After a moment, Torres started humming something else. Different melody, different everything, but the intent was the same. The filling of a gap with evidence of a person, the small human thing that persists past sense. After a moment more, from behind them, faint, carrying through the tunnel exit above, just barely audible, a single pulse of amber light, slow and rhythmic, keeping time. They came up into the morning on the north side of the river. 11 humans and 1 construct that was becoming something the Veth language didn't have a name for yet, and the sun was already bright over the hills. And the grass in the open field beyond the city moved in a proper wind, back and forth, careless and alive. Dio stood and looked at it for a moment, the moving grass, the ordinary light, the world that was still broken and still worth the trouble. He thought about what Saramea had said, the quiet one signal in the courtyard. We see you, he thought. Yeah, we're working on it. Then he turned north, and they walked.